Good afternoon and welcome back to St. Mary's Wednesdays in Lent. This is the second week of Lent, and today I'm going to direct the whole program towards the art form of spirituals. Spirituals, which we know came out of the lives and the circumstances of the slaves, is really a kind of American art form, in a sense. The interesting thing about spirituals is their texts. They're based mostly on biblical texts, some from the Old Testament, some from the New Testament, and so it's all in a Christian dimension. The slaves who came to America were brought here by force against their will in the 17th and 18th centuries, did not know the Christian gospel or anything about Christianity or about Judaism until they came to America and were taught by their owners. It's a kind of contradiction of terms, I think, that the gospel, which is about freedom and freedom in God's kingdom, was taught by people who were keeping people in slavery. That's another sermon. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some hymns that refer and songs that come out of that tradition. The first one is a very, very familiar, perhaps the most familiar hymn in all of hymnody at this point, Amazing Grace. And its story is quite an amazing thing in itself. The words were written by a man by the name of John Newton, who lived from 1725 to 1807. We'll see a slide of him, his photograph coming up here. And he was as a young man, was very rebellious. He was very anti-religion. Anything that had to do with the church, he ignored vehemently. And he lived a life that was described as being very profane. He had some of the worst language that even made sailors blush. And at a young age, because he got into trouble all the time, he was pressed or conscripted into service of the Royal Navy. So he was in the Royal Navy for several years. And then when he had finished that time, he continued working as a seafaring, as a sailor, and eventually became a captain. And he began to work with ships that were involved in the Atlantic slave transportation and transported slaves from Africa to America across the Pacific, or across the Atlantic. And the conditions under which the slaves were transported were almost indescribably awful. The lack of sanitation, the fact that they were packed in an incredibly intensely close proximity to each other, it justifies description. It was so terrible. And many died on the trip across the ocean. At any rate, we have slaves now in America who are owned by plantation owners, and they are being taught, once they're here, that they need to know about the God of Israel and Jesus, the Christian understanding of God. So they have learned this tradition, and as a result of that, they have many work songs that were just filled with descriptions of the Old Testament and things of the New Testament. They sang these songs as a way of passing the time and trying to find a way out of their troubles and their tribulations, which were real on a day-to-day basis, 24 hours a day. John Newton, who was this captain of the ships that brought slaves over, had an experience when he was on one of the ships that was still in the Royal Navy. A storm came up. He was in the Irish Sea, the Northern Sea, off the coast of Donegal, Ireland. And there was a storm that was so severe, one man standing right next to him was washed overboard, and others were being tossed all around. He and another seaman were operating pumps to get the water out of the hull of the ship so that it didn't completely sink. and the extremity of the waves was such that they had to be lashed and tied to the pump so they weren't washed overboard. He was so frightened in this experience that he called aloud to God and said, "Oh, Lord God, have mercy on us." And that was the beginning of his conversion. His conversion experience was over the period of quite a few years. He still worked as a slave trader or a captain of a ship that transported slaves. But eventually he became aware that this was indeed not something he should be involved in. He finally, because of physical requirements, had to give up traveling by sea, and he became under the influence of the woman that he loved and whom he married eventually, who helped to lead him into thinking about his spiritual life, and he began to study Christian theology. He applied to be ordained in the English church, and he was turned down. Some years later, he again applied to be ordained, and he was accepted. And he had a parish in a little town of England called Olney. And Olney is a name familiar to people in Philadelphia. There is a section of Philadelphia which is called Olney. So he lived in the rectory at Olney, and he ministered to the people of this small community, which had as their community product, they handmade lace. It was a working community, and so he was talking with working people, and he was a person of little education. So when he preached very much in first person, and he talked about his sins and his difficulties in life, and really related to the working class people. So that there was a building up of the congregation and of a spiritual awareness. One of the things that he did as a priest was to write hymns. He was ordained a priest in the Anglican Church. And he started writing hymns because he thought that was an important way to reach people. And in 1773, for New Year's Day, he wrote a hymn which is entitled Amazing Grace. The hymn was first written was just words. It didn't have a tune associated with it, and it might have just been either chanted by the congregation, intoned, or simply spoken. But the hymn came about, he had 6 verses of it. Later, the hymn became associated with the tune in America called New Britain. And that's the tune that stuck with it. For many years in England, it didn't have its own tune, and it was sung to different tunes, and then it fell into disuse. It became very unfamiliar to people. But in America, when it was brought over, it was immediately grabbed by those people who were involved in the evangelical preaching in the United States, that in the midst of what was called the Second Great Awakening. So these people knew the power of the words of these hymns, and they were particularly impressed with that of Amazing Grace. One other little item before I play the music is that Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote in her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was an anti-slavery book, and John Newton himself, when he gave up slave transportation, became an abolitionist and fought for the abolition of slavery. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, in her book, has her main character, Uncle Tom, at one point, in the midst of a deep crisis, singing out 3 of the verses of Amazing Grace, 2 of which are part of the well-known hymn. Another verse that she added to it that was not written by Newton was one that was from an old hymn that was older yet, called Jerusalem, My Happy Home. And that last verse that she added to it in her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, says, "When we were there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun." I have here a little hymn book that is a United Methodist hymn book, has only words in it, no music. And this is from 1878. And it has in it the hymn Amazing Grace, which you might be able to see here. It's very small print, and the pages are quite dingy at this point. But there are the words and the verses of Amazing Grace in this hymnal from 1878. I have one here that is older yet, that comes from a hymnal that's called Village Hymns for Social Worship, assembled by Dr. Watts. Isaac Watts was one of the most well-known hymn writers in the 18th century. And this is a hymn book which he assembled in 1826. And this little book also has Amazing Grace, and the words are here. It's number 155, if you have your copy with you. It's down here on the bottom of the page. Again, very small little hymnal, all words, no music. The first time that it was associated with the tune here in America, the tune was New Britain. And it was one of those tunes that was in the tradition of village singing called shape note singing, in which they had sopranos in one corner, altos in another corner, tenors in another corner, basses in another corner, all sitting around in a communal setting, and they sang these hymns. And the way they did it was based on, they didn't know how to read music, but they learned from this system that became taught in America through a system called shape note singing. This particular one is from 1832, and it's called the Missouri Harmony. And I have a marker in here. Amazing Grace is not in this book, but there is a hymn tune, Bourbon, which is a hymn that we sang last Sunday down here on the bottom of this page. And perhaps you can see in this dingy, weathered, aged music, the shape of the notes is unusual, and each shape of a note dictates its rhythm and also has to do with its pitch. So now to the hymn itself. This is a hymn that is so well known by everybody that it doesn't need any more introduction. And it's one that's beloved by all of America. Last week, I happened to hear a version of this hymn played by the U.S. Marine Band, and it was a fanfare by Adolphson Hailstork, a contemporary African-American composer. It was a brilliant fanfare based on Amazing Grace. Here it is in the hymn version, and I have here our 1982 hymnal, which was the first hymnal of a mainline Protestant or any denomination church in America to include it as one of their... I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry, that's the next hymn. But here we are with Amazing Grace, the tune New Britain, and there are 5 verses, and I'm going to play all 5. If you see the music now, you'll see that I'm interpreting somewhat the text. Now, moving from there to another hymn that comes in the same tradition, that is actually a little more contemporary, but it's certainly in the same spirit. And it's a hymn that's considered a spiritual. His eye is on the sparrow. The words certainly refer to Jesus in Matthew when he's talking about the care that God takes of the sparrows. And if he cares for a little sparrow that falls on the ground, he's certainly going to care for us and for any individual. The words of this hymn were written by a woman by the name of Sevilla de Martin. And she and her husband were very good friends with a man and woman whose name were Mr. and Mrs. Doolittle, who lived in Elmira, New York. They went there to visit them. Mrs. Doolittle had been confined to bed by sickness for 11 years. Mr. Doolittle experienced incurable crippling, and he had to live in a wheelchair. However, he worked, and they lived together very happily, and they were people who described as having such patience, gentleness, and cheerfulness, and such joy in their lives, that while Sevilla Martin and her husband, Dr. Martin, were visiting them, she asked the question to them one day, how do you remain so cheerful in the face of everything that you consider and have to contend with every day? And they answered, his eye is on the sparrow, and we know that he cares for us. The music was written by Charles Gabriel, and it's a tune that's been associated sometimes with a wonderful singer by the name of Ethel Walters, an African-American singer who used that as the title of her autobiography. She was in many movies, and I remember as a child seeing on television a Billy Graham crusade at which Ethel Walters was there and sang this piece in her own wonderful and inimitable way. So this is the tune, His Eye is on the Sparrow. When I first came to St. Mary's as organist and choirmaster back in 1976, we had the great pleasure every Easter of singing for the early service as well as for the late service. And the choir became, and they did double duty on Easter Day, and we had the benefit of receiving a wonderful breakfast between the services that was served by two members of the parish, Mary and Horace Sparrow. They were members of the congregation, and for years they made a wonderful cooked breakfast in the kitchen of the church for the choir for that service. It was a great offering that was appreciated so much by everyone. And I remember that when Mary Sparrow died, that Lucy Ann requested that I play that song for the funeral service, and I was very glad to do that. Now moving on to another spiritual that comes out of the real depths of the plantation songs and the slave experience is one, "Were You There When They Crucified My Lord?" This was the first hymn to be accepted into a mainline church denominational hymnal, and it was that of the Episcopal Church. And there it is, although the hymn is very old, and it was probably passed down in a kind of oral tradition from one generation of slaves to another. Of course, it describes, as you know, the story of the crucifixion, and it speaks of the suffering that Jesus was enduring. One of the aspects of these plantation songs, or the work songs and the spirituals, is that they were songs that reflected the suffering that people were experiencing, but it also was a way for them to communicate sometimes messages. Messages were implanted in some of these words, and for example, "Down by the Riverside" was a song that was used to let people know that there was going to be a service of worship, which had to be done in secret, was going to be held at the river. So when these songs were sung, they sometimes had the message of the words that were written, and sometimes they had an additional message or another text in them. This is a great and wonderful hymn that we sing here at St. Mary's every Good Friday, and it's one that most people know. It's been sung by all of the wonderful and famous singers of the past and of the present, one of whom was Marian Anderson, who was a great contralto. I'm going to play a version of it that was written as an organ prelude based on that hymn, written by Richard Purvis, who was organist of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco in the 1950s and 60s. This is a very colorful rendition of the piece, and I think that this organ does justice to it, so I hope you enjoy this setting of the piece, the spiritual, "Were You There?" In closing, I am going to direct our ears to another well-known spiritual, which is known as Deep River. This was sung by many more contemporary artists in movies. Paul Robeson was one who sang it in Showboat. It's been sung by many others at various times. Even on the TV recently, I heard Marian Anderson this past week singing it, a shot from the concert that she did in front of the Lincoln Memorial several years ago. The music of this was from the tradition of the slave music, but it was first assembled and put together in a really beautiful fashion by a man by the name of Harry T. Burleigh. He was the grandson of a slave, and his father worked as an abolitionist during his brief lifetime. His father died rather young in life, and as Harry was reared in Erie, Pennsylvania, and traveled to New York City as a very poor but aspiring young musician. He had a beautiful voice. He grew up, interestingly enough, in an Episcopal church, but he sang in various traditions, and he applied for a scholarship at the National Conservatory of Music in New York City, which was founded in 1866. And he was there a few years later than that. And as a young man, he applied there, and he was not accepted the first day he auditioned. He was so tense about what he was doing. The next day, they allowed him to audition a second time, realizing that he was highly nervous about his initial singing. So he sang, he was accepted immediately, and he came under the influence of a visiting composer from Europe, Anton Dvorak, who was spending a year at the conservatory, the National Conservatory of Music in New York City. And this was in the early part of the 20th century. He had a difficult life, but as soon as, and he worked to support himself as a custodian of the school, and he kept body and soul together, and he advanced musically. He had a voice that was so highly valued by people who heard it that he eventually was sponsored by the British ambassador to the US to go to England to sing there for the king, and was a tremendous success, and had then tours, many of them throughout Europe. Came back to the United States and continued in a great career. For 52 years, he sang as soloist at St. George's Episcopal Church. And we have a picture, I think, of Harry T. Burleigh and also of the church coming up. He was the first African-American singer in this church, and the first week he sang there, half of the choir walked out. The second week he sang there, they were all back. They had heard him sing, and the church just got behind him, and he was a beloved singer who sang there for 52 years as baritone soloist. So you will see some photographs of him in his choir vestment and pictures of St. George's Church, which is on Stuyvesant Square in Lower Manhattan. They've had a great tradition of music. One of the photographs you'll see is an older one of the back of the church, where there's a very historic organ, which has since been removed, and the church now has the main organ up in the front of the church. But the music has continued to be a great part of the ministry of that church. So Harry T. Burleigh was known not only for concertizing in Europe and throughout the United States, but as an arranger of spirituals. And the one with which he became particularly associated was this tune of Deep River. And this was also a tune that was sung by the Fisk University of Nashville, Tennessee. After this, going as far back as the 1870s, after the Civil War, this African-American school in Nashville started touring with their choir throughout the United States and even to Europe, raising money to support those who had been freed, the slaves who had been freed but had no other means of physical of financial support. And interestingly enough, this Fisk University still has one of the most brilliant choirs in the United States today. They're a spectacular group, and their singing of spirituals and other things is something to be cherished if the opportunity arises for you to hear them. So this beautiful tune, which is very soulful, has a text that is really quite short, but it's going to come up on the screen, and is Deep River, and it talks about the soul longing to cross, to be in campground and to cross the river. So it's an expression of physical life here on earth, but also of leaving this physical plane and going to heaven. And the campground refers to the camp meeting revival services that were experienced in the 19th and the 18th, 19th, and the early 20th centuries. And these were places which people had great experiences spiritually, and they were together as community. There was lots and lots of singing, and this is one of those references to the campground as being a place, a kind of paradise. So as a close today, I'm going to close with this tune, Deep River, which was sung by Harry T. Burley in many, many, many concerts. It became his signature, and it's a song today that we've heard in movies and by various people, and you're going to see the words and the music on the screen.
doing next?
Next week, we're taking a very different tack, but music that, or different track, music that is some of it from the very classic part of hymnody, and again, tunes that are well known, but about which you may not know, be acquainted with their history, but some hymns that will really stand up and dance. So join us next week. Thank you.